Hundreds of protesters across the Israeli-occupied West Bank have voiced their outrage at the Israeli parliament's latest bill, which makes the death by hanging the default sentence for Palestinians convicted of a lethal act of terrorism. In Ramallah, relatives of Palestinian prisoners and activists staged a sit-in in front of the headquarters of the International Committee of the Red Cross. There was also condemnation from the EU and human rights groups who say the punishment discriminates against Palestinians. The new death penalty law is set to take effect in 30 days, but its implementation could be delayed by a legal challenge at Israel's highest court. DW correspondent Felix Tamsut in Jerusalem is following the story for us. Felix, how is the passing of this controversial law being received by the public in Israel?
Well, you could say that there are two parts of Israeli society in terms of the reactions to this law. First of all, you have the supporters of the current government with its far-right elements that see it as some sort of a way to restore what they call deterrence against terrorism. On the other hand, you have the supporters of the Israeli opposition, as well as NGOs and other groups that have criticized this law. Some said that it's part of a maneuver by far-right Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir ahead of the elections this year. Some argued that the new law is discriminatory, and it remains to be seen how Israel's Supreme Court is going to decide on the case.
You mentioned the elections coming up later this year. To what extent did those play a role in the law's passing, you think?
Well, some would argue that the way that Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the Otzma Yehudit party, the Jewish Power Party, the way it translates, that his push to seal this law into Israel's Book of Laws is as a result of the fact we're talking about an election year in Israel. It also needs to be said, however, that Itamar Ben-Gvir's campaign back in 2022 included the death penalty for Palestinian terrorists as part of his campaign. So as far as his supporters are concerned, he's just making up on his election promise.
What practical impact could this have on life in the Palestinian territories?
This remains to be seen. It's not yet known. The one aspect which we could already say is that the difference between how Palestinians are being tried in the occupied territories in comparison to Israelis. Palestinians are being tried by a military court in comparison to Israeli citizens that live in the occupied territories that are being tried by a civil court. This is where this difference could be vital and could make a real difference in terms of the verdicts that we're gonna hear. Another aspect which needs to be mentioned is the protests against the Palestinian Authority and against its cooperation with Israel, which we've been seeing in several cities across the West Bank, and it remains to be seen what sort of effects those protests will have on life in the Palestinian territories.
Now, as a reaction to the decision in the Knesset yesterday, a coalition of opponents of the law are launching a petition to Israel's Supreme Court to declare the legislation null and void. Could the judges still stop this?
In theory, yes, and many expect it to happen here in Israel. At the same time, it needs to be said that the current climate in the public debate in Israel when it comes to the Supreme Court and the way it sometimes intervenes in legislation has been criticized by many parts of society here, mostly supporters of the current government, mostly the far-right aspects of it, the far-right elements of it. And this climate could have some sort of an influence on the decision. Despite that, many NGOs and liberal left-wing voices within the Israeli public debate hope that this legislation is going to be at least delayed, when not cancelled completely.
DW correspondent Felix Tamsut in Jerusalem. Thanks so much. Let's keep talking about this and bring in Max Lux. He's a member of the German Bundestag for the opposition Greens. He's also his parliamentary group's spokesperson on human rights and humanitarian issues. Welcome to DW. Now, first up, I'd like to get your reaction to the Knesset's decision.
Thank you for having me today. Oh, I'm very disappointed about this law and about the fact that this law found a majority in the Knesset, not only as a left-wing politician, but also as a Democrat and as a deep friend of Israel, because this law is undermining basic and fundamental human rights, and it's also undermining the European Convention of Human Rights. And Israel's Knesset is kind of related to the European Convention of Human Rights as an observer to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So this law is an attack on human rights, it's an attack on Palestinians, but it's also an attack on the strong relations between Europe and Israel, and that makes me feel very disappointed.
Proponents of the law say it's meant to deter terrorists. Is that then not what this will achieve, in your opinion?
So this law creates a decision by law to point out to a special group of people and to discriminate a special group of people within the law. And that is why it's not very sensible for me to say that this law is kind of providing terrorism or anything. This law gives discrimination and implements discrimination in the law system. And it makes the Israeli rule of law system by that less a real rule of law functioning system.
Now, in a social media post, you called this decision a heavy burden on European-Israeli relations and called for consequences. You hinted at it before briefly, but maybe expand on what you think those should be.
So, I'm very disappointed because I thought that there is a big key for the relations between Israel and Europe over the observer status of the Knesset at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. We have several resolutions in the Council of Europe where we say our hope and our goal for the future is to have a state of Israel alongside a Palestinian state, both being full members of the European Convention of Human Rights, being full members of the Council of Europe. But if you want to be a member of the Council of Europe, and if you want to have relations to the Council of Europe, such as an observer, you have to implement and you have to be associated to the guidelining rules of the European Convention of Human Rights. And one of the guidelining principles is to don't have any kind of death penalty. And the Knesset breaks with that. The Knesset breaks with that in a way that is unacceptable. So it has to have consequences for the Knesset status at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. But what I really hope, really hope, is that we will see that the democratic movement of Israel will rise and it will stop this law. It will back the highest court in a good decision. And I hope that we see better days for the European-Israeli relations to come. And the democratic movement in Israel is not over yet. They need our support right now. DW just showed pictures of people in the West Bank demonstrating against this law. There are also so many people within the Israeli society demonstrating, protesting against this law, and they need our support right now.
Yeah, and aiming to challenge it at the country's highest court. You mentioned it there. And I want to look at the German government's reaction to this for a second. You're, of course, in the opposition. The government spokesperson expressed regret over the decision. Now, besides words of condemnation, what actions would you like to see from Germany's leadership?
So, yeah, you're right. The government expressed some regrets over a spokesperson. And this is too little and too less, to be honest. We need not only words coming from the government, we need actions coming from the government reacting to this. We need actions toward the Israeli government. I think we need sanctions, stronger sanctions against the far-right ministers in the Israeli government to hit this far-right government and especially this very disappointing parts of government, but not the Israeli society. And we need also to look at the European level and to find a common strategy towards Israel. Not only words, we need actions right now also coming from our government to protect human rights.
That's German lawmaker Max Lux. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.